In other words, he's not messing around, right? And I think similarly, when it comes to people's relationships, like I see AI Circle as being a 10-year long endeavor, right? Like, how do you sustain and build a community for people that, like, if I'm saying, hey, let's play long term games with long term people in a short lived community, that doesn't make sense.
Hello, I'm Adam Haney, and this is the Open Story Podcast where I talk to technology leaders, builders, and visionaries about their projects and passions. Today, I'm joined by Albert Chun, founder of AI Circle. Albert, thank you for taking the time.
Good to be here.
Thanks, man. Listen, I know you have done all sorts of really interesting things. You're running AI Circle now, but you have a really storied career. Would you care to kick things off and give us a walkthrough of kind of your journey? Like, I know you started in education, you've done some things in public policy, you worked leading AI teams at Invisible. Like, what's your journey kind of been like?
Yeah, so I graduated college during an economic recession, and during that time I jumped into education. I was a middle school teacher, a founding middle school teacher in the Bay Area. I remember teaching every single subject for the seventh grade for the same students, and then looping up with them in the eighth grade. In my third year, I became the principal, started a high school and an elementary school, because when you are in the middle, you ask yourself, you build this great school and you send them off to maybe a less than stellar school. And so you wanted to kind of build out that entire pipeline, if you will, to college. And then I was in public school in the Bay Area, moved to New York City. And actually, to backtrack a little bit, after being at some of those schools, I had also started a robotics program, an e-commerce business with my wife, and a think tank with some folks in New York City and just some academic and government leaders globally. Went over to New York City, wanting a change of scenery, and got into the nonprofit world where we basically helped low performing schools turn around. And I worked in the South Bronx, and I helped one school turn around, and we helped start two new public schools. And around then, that's actually when I knew I was going to have my first son. And I had a bit of a paradigm shift where I'd spent almost a decade taking care of a bunch of other people's kids and want to kind of focus on my own. And yeah, when I went to grad school, I started a couple of startups that both ultimately failed, one at the School of Ed and one at the business school, and learned a great deal, learned that I love entrepreneurship. And I realized in hindsight, I had been doing it all along, right? Starting
Yeah.
schools is really akin to starting a business. And yeah, I started in ed tech and then pivoted to insure tech, and there went on to Invisible, where led a team of folks in human data to fine tune world-class models. And after leaving Invisible, started AI Circle.
That's so cool. Well, I would love to kind of double click on when you were making this transition from education and I guess you were already doing entrepreneurial things, but what made you decide, hey, I want to double click and really dive into AI focused things? Like, what was that transition like for you?
So the pivot from ed tech to private sector. Honestly, I always had a little bit of a chip on my shoulder. I grew up in the Bay Area, and while I loved education and taking care of kids, and we became like the number one schools in the city and district and in the state. And at one point, one of the schools I worked with was the number one in the country. And I think I really liked hitting the ceiling and trying to just being the best at what I did. And I felt in some ways that I had seen that in education. So it was like in the public part and the private part, and starting up new schools and turning out some of the worst ones. And it was incredible. But then, yeah, going over to the private sector, like ed tech, I think we 3 to 4x revenue in less than a year, right? And that was incredible. It was post pandemic. Everyone was not buying tech anymore. Being the first commercial hire and, leading through post sales for the first time, building it out for the first time, right? The first renewals were coming when you're we were a pre-seed startup at the time. And I thought, oh, this is cool. And I'm learning, but the ceiling did not feel very high. Like winning in ed tech always felt like, could I win a bit more? Am I really is there a more meatier problem to solve with some of the better competitors. And so I wanted to go, that's why I moved over to InsurTech. It felt like, okay, this was a Series B company. They had already gotten to 6 million in revenue. And I thought, okay, this is a worthwhile problem. I'd be pivoting in. I don't know anything about finance or anything, right? Small funny story, Adam. I remember when I first moved to New York City, I was hanging out with a bunch of like private equity investment banker guys, and they were all so kind and generous. And I remember after I hung out with them for the first time, I went home and I Googled what bullish meant because I was like, dude, what are these guys talking about? What's bearish? What's this? And like, I just knew I was totally out of my depth, right? And so when I went over to InsurTech, like I ended up taking on increasingly large teams. They hired me to manage 3 people, and then it ultimately was a couple hundred people, and we ended up doubling revenue. And I was like, oh my gosh, this was one of the hardest things I had done to that point, but so worthwhile. And I thought, okay, I feel like I can compete with other startups that are, solving these really expensive problems. And the thing that really actually helped me pivot over was that I had gotten laid off. I was part of a 4th round layoff. I had seen my own redundancy, candidly. When I saw the P&L, I was like, yeah, this doesn't really make sense when we look at our trajectory and some of the discussion we're having at a high level. And then I got a call from Dave Klein, because at that point I was writing on LinkedIn about, what I had been learning about building teams and customer onboarding and hiring and post sales and being a consultative seller, having led a few hundred sellers at that InsurTech job. And yeah, Dave was at the time writing avidly on LinkedIn. So I knew him he was like a LinkedIn friend, and he was an advisor at Invisible, told me about, it was, I think, the director of operations or VP of operations, whatever the post sales work was there. You hear about ChatGPT 2 and 3 and whatever. Like, I still had a feeling that AI would lead to our destruction, and it was somehow like, result in some like Terminator scenario. But yeah, when I really thought through it, it was actually thinking about that Terminator scenario that was actually what drove me to it. Because at the time, it was still very nascent, right? Like Q3 2023, like who knew what? The ultimate decision to jump in was, hey, if this really is a potentially very dangerous technology that requires a great amount of accountability and all the things, like would I want to be on the sidelines complaining about what all these AI people are doing, or would I want to be in it to help prevent dumb decisions from happening? And I ultimately decided just to lean in as hard as I could. Yeah.
Well, awesome. Well, I mean, Invisible Technologies at that time was heavily focused on human data for AI models. For people that aren't familiar, what do those projects look like? What is the client like seeking, from a vendor that's making those kinds of
Yeah.
data projects? And what did you do?
So at a high level, Invisible provided post-training data to Gen AI companies, right? But what did that look like? What does it look like? After you pre-train a model on all the internet and all these things, and you want to really refine the model in the post-training process to tell it what good looks like in whatever domain you're looking at, you need to tell them. Like, you need to tell the model, hey, this is what good looks like. I prefer this response to that response, or I think this response is a 1 out of 7 and this is a 7 out of 7 for this reason. You need a lot of humans to do that. A lot of people who are aligned on what good looks like, on a rubric, on guidelines, and you need to provide a lot of explicit data to the AI engineers or product engineers to fine tune the model for a certain use case. And so, but at the time, what did that look like? Like, what does frontier data look like? Like, what does it look like when your client invented RAG and the transformer? What does that look like? Well, it looks like you have no idea because it has never been done before. And so you'd have to read a research paper that was cited maybe like 15 times, and another one, and this and that, and get all of these different resources to find something that, like, build out a campaign that made sense and align so frequently with the end user or researcher or engineer on what good data look like, and build some kind of feedback loop to constantly iterate and improve the process to get the highest signal data.
Yeah, what was your information diet like at that point in time? You mentioned papers. Are you just on archive all day reading through sort of the latest publications, or like I remember at that time there was a race to create all of these data teams, and to your point, like everybody was doing it, new and for the first time. I think Invisible did a great job of keeping up with the frontier research, but that was a lot of work. What was that process like for you in terms of educating yourself and staying on top of people that were publishing and launching so frequently?
For me, I have always liked to go into areas where the threshold to learn is very high or the ceiling to learn is very high. And so, well, I'll say this. It all started with our interview. I remember you sharing with me, I felt very insecure and like an imposter applying for an AI job, having no experience with AI. And you telling me, reassuring me multiple times that it was okay. But if I wanted to know, to look through the A16Z glossary, which I did. And it was actually the way I remember learning at one point of reading through the dictionary and thesauruses and what have you. I'd be the guy who, remember when cargo pants were a thing? Like, I would keep a pocket Oxford dictionary in my, like, on me at all times, and I would just kind of like read through. I know it's just to set the frame that I like consuming a lot of
Right.
information, and I like to get to the primary source. I don't want to infer. I don't like secondhand and third hand information. I like to get to the source because there's always some level of telephone, or someone's always going to, your manager or your coworker is always going to pull out something that is activated by their prior knowledge, and I just need it for myself. And so and during the time, there were so many. Well, at first, I would learn from other people as much as possible. There's so much to learn from the people within Invisible, right? So many things I didn't know, so many acronyms and so many different approaches, and so many complex ideas that got distilled down. But then I started realizing that, not everyone knows everything. And so I started going to papers, and reading archive papers were, I think, the most important thing for me as a primary source. And then it became actually doing the annotation myself. I would actually argue that that was probably one of the most important things. So like reading about, let's say, hey, this RLHF process and preference pairs and these different types of capabilities and constraints when it comes to prompting a model and how you evaluate and doing evals and all this stuff. I realized academic jargon versus real world hands-on keys. What does that mean? It's not that difficult. And I would argue it was this great feedback loop. The more I read, the more I knew, and then I wanted to annotate and do this in real time. And the more I annotated and got to know what this actually meant, made the reading, it just increased my confidence a great deal and helped me read through and build a framework for learning. So yeah, it would be archive papers, research papers, YouTubes. I would go on deep learning and take all the free courses at like Google and LinkedIn Learning. But the part that I learned the most after doing the work and the archive papers was talking to people in different orgs,
Yeah.
because yeah, they were doing their own research and learning, and then they were distilling it down into practice. And practice is ultimately what really matters. And hearing someone's like months long, years long battle with this and telling me what actually was important to their business to make money or keep money or what raise money was very important. So I actually had about 175 coffees in my first year at Invisible.
Wow.
And yeah, I would make it a point to go to the city at least once or twice a week. And I would take 4 to 5 calls a day there, or coffees and whatnot. I remember inviting you to some of them, right? Because that's where I learned the fastest. And it was like, here's an example, Adam. When I meet with a solutions engineer or architect, I get to hear how they are showcasing their work and applying it specifically to someone's use case. And then I talk to an AE or BD person, and they tell me how their deals are won or lost. And that's how I learn, let's say, for example, hey, I fine-tuned this model, I sold it to this person, I got to the evaluation stage. Oh, what's an evaluation? Well,
Right.
this happens with their data scientists. Okay, let me talk to a data scientist. How do you eval this? Okay, so you build a rubric, you have this guiding question, it has to tie to this, and you actually are highly biased because this technology you're bringing on is actually taking your job, right? If I understand that, then when I go talk to let's say my TPM on my side, I understand maybe as much or even more about their business than they do. And then I can offer, hey, let me take a guess. Your go-to-market team, are they having trouble closing deals at the eval stage? They'll say, oh, how did you know that? Well,
Yeah.
we actually run evals on domain specific cases just like this. Does that make sense to you? right? And so the more I learned about different parts of the org and where their pain points were, and the more I could bring it back home to my client, and I'm selling something that we could actually do and helping them sell more and help them win in the long run, because it is important to win in getting at the time. What does it mean to win for a model when you're fine tuning a
Yeah.
model? What's the perplexity score? What's the MMMU? What's the blah, blah, blah? What's the blue score? Whatever. Is that really what makes you win? Maybe. I don't know. Last time I checked, if you look at the Hugging
Yeah.
Face league board, they're not all the frontier model makers. They're these, like, these guys who are learning how to fine tune models on Twitter and whatever. But why aren't they millionaires and billionaires?
Right.
All of them. Because there's more to the business than just a score. Okay. And so how do you help your client win on not just getting a good score, but on closing more deals or solving a trickier problem or more complex workflow? Or, how do you align, let's say, a multilingual fine tuning campaign in Japanese because they're about to close a deal with Sony, right? It's like helping them to make all of those things connect, provided a great deal of value to them, to us, and expanded our capabilities and things. But yeah, like learning, it went from like research and very esoteric high level stuff and diagrams and learning from whatever to like, no, well, what part of the research and learning actually mattered? Like what actually made money, right? Which ultimately was, I think, ended up being the most important thing.
There's so many things in that I love about that answer. Like one being, you didn't say, "Hey, I just got my PhD in computer science and I had done all these things and I had done all of I was aligned with all of the institutions that allowed me to do this." You just started doing it. And I think that that's really cool. And like one of the things that is really interesting about, now both there's so many different courses, so many different papers, as well as that now that you have models that can help you to ask questions about some of these different papers. It's like it's the barrier to entry for smart people that really care. You can get into just about any domain topic now, which is amazing. And then secondly, I mean, I think what you're saying in terms of just go talk to people that are actually doing it, and not just the research scientists and not just the engineers that are working on those teams, but also the business development folks, the TPMs, like everybody all the way through that life cycle, because they're going to see the world in different ways, but also that exposure is going to lead them to run into gaps in the models, gaps
Yep.
in the current way that we go to market, whatever the case
Yep.
might be, that are going to teach you. So I love the way that you approached that.
Yeah. Can I say something? Like, I hear this all the time, right? How do I get started? How do I learn? And like something I think is very important is for people to ask as many dumb questions as they can. But it may not be in the approach that you think, right? Like, I don't think it's very helpful to ask one person all of your dumb questions, right? They'll come away thinking like, wow, this guy's an idiot and wasted my time. But in reality, and maybe you do that with your close friends or whatever, you have a close mentor, and I don't mean to be too harsh, but I think what could be a more helpful thing is if you go and ask one or two dumb questions per conversation that you have. It doesn't have to be dumb, right? It's just something that, can you help me understand, or can you break that down? I like to caveat that, guys, I'm not an engineer. I'm not technical, but I would love to. Is this what I'm hearing you're saying? Or could you help me put this in layman terms? And the thing that you're actually doing when you do that, you are actually helping the person who is sharing it with you, because the best way to learn is often to teach, right? To distill something down and crystallize it. It actually helps both people. And I think right now, I think some people think it's, oh man, it's so late, or everyone's an expert and I don't know what this or that means. I actually think it's okay to be vulnerable and ask. And I think it's actually helpful to the person. But knowing that, just to spread out your questions to different people to get different takes. And by time, like just by repetition, the questions get more sophisticated over time, like unavoidably.
Yeah. I think that makes complete sense. And I also I will say I've been having so many conversations just directly with models in order to try to teach myself that they're also really great conduits for dumb questions. But I do think that people have to be vulnerable to learn. And so like you have to be willing to say, I don't know something. And it's not because there's some flaw with the person that doesn't know. It's just that they have not yet learned it. And so yeah, I think the much more dangerous thing that I've seen is when people pretend to know and then they never actually pick up whatever the concept is, or they find themselves in situations where it's like, oh man, I really wish I would ask the question now.
Yeah, that's true.
So yeah, I totally agree. Well, I'm curious, like in addition to understanding the models and understanding the details of how these programs went into training data, you were also leading a really large team of humans. What was that experience like? I know that you talked before about in some of the other startups that you had worked at that you had led other teams, but as far as I know, this was almost 1,000 people that you were managing, right? Like what was the process like there? How did you think about finding the right people? How did you think about building a culture within that team? And then ultimately, I know that they had some pretty incredible results in terms of what they were able to accomplish. Like, what do you think led to their success?
Yeah. Well, one, I think a big part of this story, along with all the stories I feel like I have, is a great deal of luck. I was seated with an incredible foundation. What I have to do with that process? Nothing, right? And so, great deal of luck there with the core team, and some of those core team ended up being really instrumental leaders throughout the process, and some of the people I still like, man, most remarkable people that I've ever worked with. Yeah, I think there are a few things that come to mind. One, it's actually learning to win, right? So what I mean by why is that important? Why do I start with that? Because one, no one likes to be on a losing team. No one wants to be like, hey, can I be on the mediocre team who's unremarkable and forgettable and blah, blah, blah? Like, no one wants to do that. And so, like, what was the most important thing for me was actually learning what was the most important thing for the business. I went over and I sleuthed through Whimsical and I found our CEO's mind map of all the most important things for him. I knew like I needed to figure out what's the most important things for the boss and like for the business. And it aligned with what I knew to be important to a business. When I was a chief of staff, you're thinking about margins and like, so you're thinking about lowering costs, increasing margins and, multi-threading into an account, de-risking the business and, figuring out how to cross-sell, expand and, improve the sales motion and get client referrals and all the things. And so I wanted to know what those numbers were so that I can manage to the numbers, lead to the numbers and whatnot. And candidly, I wanted to just destroy the numbers. And so that was most important. And then at this high level, right? So we picked basically 3 to 5 of these objectives from the org and then breaking those down into key results, 3 to 5 per, and then which ones seemed the most actionable and setting out a task, lead activities that would result in that end result. And it was assigning and getting the people to own each portion of that and be the master of that domain. And because some of the things I learned, I think even when teaching students, right, like that they rise to the level of your expectation. Like, when I was teaching kids in the hood who came to 7th grade with a kindergarten level, and I was like, no, you're going to leave here and after 2 years, you're going to be able to crush it in high school. And for kids who literally would write fives backwards, would call me sophomore year, junior, hey, Miss Chen, I just want to show you my straight A's in math, right? Like that's the kind of stuff you want to do. And so what I knew is, okay, what if you're not 12, but you're mid-career and you want to do this thing? Like, I know that you want to crush it. And if I tell you that, hey, I want us to build the best model in the world, that like, you're going to want to do that, right? And
Yeah.
so I think that was very important. And then making it it was not perfect here, by the way. There's imperfections all around. I messed up like so many times, not even funny, but like try to aspire to do is lead, like have a culture of meritocracy. That's so hard to do when you have several hundred people on the team and everyone is really good. We need to constantly know what good looks like and know and those things. I feel like some of the best people who are solving those two problems. I actually think that's the secret recipe, if I'm being honest, is like how well can you uphold the bar for what good looks like and how well can you train that to someone who knows nothing? So it's like, what I mean by that is like, so if quality is everything, then to scale, you need to be able to show what quality looks like for everyone. You actually keep needing to raise the bar for quality by doing increasingly hard things. And I'd like to think that I'm repetitive enough that like, and that's part of the thing. You have to be very repetitive when you're teaching a group or like leading a group that large, is that like we want to do hard things really, really well. And we need to do increasingly hard things. Why? If I'm doing really hard things, solving really hard problems, that will require a lot of work. What does that mean? My competitors need to outwork me to take my work.
Yeah.
But if I can do that increasingly hard work at the highest quality, then you can compete. Then my client gets to compete with all of their competitors and I'll compete them. Right. And so like, yeah, I took that very seriously.
I know that after Invisible, you started AI Circle. What was that process like for you? And what led you to decide that that was
Yeah.
something that you would want to start?
Yeah. So I actually pitched the idea of AI Circle, I think 2 months into joining Invisible, because it was very clear that the ceiling to learn for AI was so high. Like, mind you, like I spent like a month and a half before joining Invisible reading like 5 books, right? Like to be prepared. Like I really wanted to do right by the company and the client, right? And my team. And yeah, 2 months in of doing all of this learning on my own, I was like, whoa, like this is, having been educated, there's no way you can keep up. And again, this was when the rate of learning and change was relatively slow then, if you like compare it to today. And so like I knew was the learning was very high. I knew the money to be made was ridiculous. And I knew that because ChatGPT had come out the year before, the ability to get talent who knows this stuff, you're not going to get it. 1 out of 100 person who knew about Palm or BERT or whatever, studied AI or ML, like it's very few. And so I knew that the talent squeeze was going to be there. And then I knew that people would want to pivot and they would want to get promoted, right? And so um, all those angles, and then honestly, there's a very selfish thing for me was like I knew I could not just be a full-time student while be a full-time worker and a full-time all the things, right? And so like I needed a better way to learn. So yeah, I remember pitching it to I want to say maybe a dozen founders to put this into their existing professional network or to build one. And like I got a range from like, oh, that's not our ICP to wow, that sounds cool, but no real like, when you get a yes, but like it's like nothing really comes from it. Like, oh, that's a really great idea. And then it just kind of fizzles out. And so I had been, without knowing, I'd been building AI Circle through those 175 coffees, right? And because what I started to learn is I was becoming a 100 wheel spoke. Well, I remember meeting many founders, inviting them to AI Circle, and then catching up with them a month or two later, being like, I got into YC, or I raised $1 million. I thought, wow, that's cool. Some people are saying they found their co-founder at AI Circle or met their new hire or got a job or got promoted. Like all of that is cool. But for me, it's all candidly a little secondary to the core value, in my opinion, which is it is very difficult to have a high powered career. It becomes like the world gets very lonely and difficult to like it's very easy to get beat down, in other words, right? And for me, is a very core problem of like how do you solve for loneliness and to build friendships in like a digital age? And then sure, again, all the things are gonna like the byproducts are, hey, you help you get this, help you get that. But like actually I think the core problem is like human connection. Not to sound hella cheesy, but like I will say it's a personal problem of my own, right? Like I know this not by secondhand. And there's this part of I think it is I have been the beneficiary of being friends with people who are better than me and who inspire me. Like I have a guy, one of my friends, he texted me yesterday. He's like, Albert, let's do 300 squats today. I was like, okay, like let's do it. And then the next thing he texted me, he's like, let's do 100 pull-ups, right? Like it's great to have friends who kind of nudge you and have you do something that's very uncomfortable or difficult to do. And like another's like, hey, I read this paper. Let's read this paper together. Meeting with someone this Thursday who wants to start a book club, right? Like, great. Man, I don't have the bandwidth for that. Don't even know if I can do that. But shoot, like I'm willing to
But
like
now you
I
have
love the
to because
push.
like now the book club is coming and you've got to
I
read your
know.
chapters. Yeah.
I know, right?
Well, I don't want to take for granted, if somebody is not familiar with AI Circle, I guess like maybe I should take one step back and say like what exactly is the AI Circle community? Who are the people that are in it? What kind of events do you throw? Like, tell me more. What's the elevator pitch for AI Circle?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, AI Circle, it's a community or for professionals in AI, right? And what we do is we facilitate and build that community, this online platform and WhatsApp groups for people to connect and we also host events. So like we've hosted events with people and builders from Google, DeepMind, and Amazon AGI. And just last week we had Shai, one of the ML engineers from Anthropic, speaking with some of the folks at Vast Data and Foundry about test time compute. So we like to get people at these large companies who are building, and then small startups, people who are investing, people who are thinking of starting things.
Well, I mean, I know I've been to several of your events and like continue to be impressed at, how smart and plugged in the people that show up to those events are, but also that the community's overall vibe is very open and kind and co-educational, which it makes a ton of sense based on your background that those are the kinds of people that you're attracting to that group. I'm curious, is there anything that you think that you are doing that is filtering for a certain kind of person or a certain way that they show up at your events? How are you thinking about deliberately building the culture of that community?
That's a great question. One, this is a painful answer, but I'll just say the hardest thing up front is I've had to say no to hundreds of people who wanted to join AI Circle. Initially, I thought the goal was to get as many people into AI Circle. And when you're like 50 people, like that's not a bad goal. Like, you have like 5 people in New York City and 50 globally. Like that's not very helpful for someone who's joining a community for like hang out with 4 people. But so I was initially optimizing for that and it didn't make sense. Sure, people I thought were high quality and people were great. But then I started to realize that time is very precious and I had been a part of these other groups before, right? Where there's like 25,000 people on a Slack group and I'm an email to be spammed or, someone with a B2B title to sell into. And I hated that. And I thought it was annoying. And I didn't want to build a community that I didn't like. And it's something that I would personally want to join, right? And so I think that part is important. And then the second part is, let's say you have someone who has amazing credentials, but they're an asshole, right? Yeah, that's also someone I like would probably not be good for them joining a circle. Or wouldn't get in, right? Because we don't want to build a culture that way, like innovation and partnership, and it doesn't work in that community setting. And I'm pretty clear with the mission and vision and values and norms and guidelines for the group. Like here's an example of reasons why I will tell you I think people shouldn't join AI Circle. I don't think you should join AI Circle to get a job. I don't think you should get an AI Circle to find customers. I don't think you should get to AI Circle because these transactional things, if you know what I mean, right? Like I remember someone pinging me from a great company, right? Had all the things you'd want to join, right? They were technical, some engineer from some big tech Mag 7 company said, hey, like I'm looking for a job and I wanted to join AI Circle. Okay, hey, that sounds cool. I'll make introductions for you. I'll tell you how to find that. But joining a community to do that is, in my opinion, yeah, again, just not the kind of community I want to build. And the reason why, remember, the core problem I want to solve is not for people to get a job. It's a byproduct. If the core reason is, let's say, that life is difficult, life does not get easier if I have a bunch of people asking me for things, right? It actually doesn't help. The hallmark, maybe a better metric is, hey, when things are really freaking hard, could you help someone? That's actually a better indicator of someone who I would want to join AI Circle, because what happens? Tragedy has struck AI Circle members, even in the short tenure that we've been around. The question is, well, what are you going to do about it? Right. And sure, sometimes that looks like a gap in employment. And sure, you can be helpful as far as you can be helpful. But like, I think leading with that and having that promise, I've actually made that mistake because I'm not a recruiter. Like I can't magically make an introduction that will get you a multi six-figure job in a month, right? Like that. It's just I'm not that kind of fairy godmother. And so, but yeah, ultimately, I think the most important parts are real, genuine people, but that you are building something meaningful, right? And that you're contributing to the frontier of AI, because finding that like interesting part where, hey, you're a good human being and you're building something really cool is a cross section. If people want to, like, hey, you know what, man, I'm a go-to-market person, I just want to sell. Great, I can name you like 5 communities you should join. Or if you want to look for a job, all the other things, again, like I can do that. Like finding for that rare air ends up becoming the value prop is that, hey, I want to be in this group of people who are kind-hearted and impressive, if you will, is kind of the cross section that I want to build at.
I love that. And I think that that's absolutely right. That there are so many, I'm in a dozen Slack groups and maybe I'm part of the problem, but that are very transactional, where you're like there's a channel for like chit chat, but then there's like a jobs channel. And
Yeah.
that's like where people actually end up spending like the majority
Yeah.
of their time. And so like, I think that designing it for a real genuine connection is just much more fulfilling for people.
Yeah. And I'll share 2 things that we're actually doing that is coming up. Is one is I actually met a couple of founders of this younger community of people in 1 to 3 years of work experience. and we're talking about how hard it is to navigate their career. And so I said, oh, I know people who would love to coach and be a mentor, and they have people who need to be mentored, right? And so we're hosting this session second week of June where we have mentors from Instagram, Meta, Microsoft, Walmart, whatever, all like these folks, like exited founders and folks in VC who will mentor folks, like the analyst from McKinsey or the intern at some VC, right? And so we'll be hosting that event. And another one is I'm actually talking to some nonprofit leaders around how do we help students in, let's say, the South Bronx code, right? Like, why do we need to just help the elite and people who can maybe not need the most help? I actually think when I'm building relationships, at least, it's not the most meaningful relationships that I've had in my life are the ones not where we're just like impressed with the other person. Not really. I think I have like one relationship like that. And it's like my wife, but like everyone else, it's like more like that. We're building something together. We have this aspirational goal or this really hard problem to solve. And I think that's where my most meaningful relationships come from. And so like, how do I build that into AI Circle? It's like, okay, cool. We can have a happy hour. Hey, we can have a panel. Hey, you can be in a group with your esteemed peers. But also it's like, okay, can you do something meaningful together while doing some good in the world is something I'm trying to figure out and bring into our community.
I love that.
Yeah.
Well, I'm curious, like, are there things that your community members are talking about that you think are maybe not discussed enough as it relates to AI? Like, are there new trends that you're seeing that people are focusing on, or where are people's sort of attentions shifting, right now?
It is very hard to find ideas that are not covered in some corner of Twitter or LinkedIn. But I do get some of these randomly. One person that I thought was interesting, he's a great guy. He was like, Albert, why don't you provide fine tuning data for robots? And I was like, I know that there are people out there who are doing it, but I hadn't thought through it. Like, like, let's say if your client is physical intelligence, like, okay, so what does that look like? And going through that exercise and thinking, okay, that is it's a meaningful, large margin problem to solve. And if the world is going on edge, like I know Nvidia's hanging out there, a bunch of people are hanging out there. Okay, like what does that look like? Like I'd be curious what some of our human data companies are thinking about when providing fine-tuning data for AI at the edge, right? Like I don't think a bunch of people are talking about it. I don't think that's a hot thing right now or whatever. But when I look at it, I was like, okay, Figure just, sever their relationship with OpenAI. They're building their own model. I know requires fine tuning. Like, what would it look to do that? I know some of my GPU friends are talking about test time compute. I know NeoCloud is like huge right now, and I think it's worthwhile to look at. I mean, there are so many startups I see who are building there, and I think that's interesting. I have other ideas that that I know are very juicy and interesting, but like I can't share because I feel like that's
Sure.
someone's like $1 billion idea, and like confidentiality is like a big thing at AI Circle. But it is actually one of those weird times where it is not too bad to really sit and think about the industry and where it could be heading next instead of trying to optimize for what was. You can't optimize for frontier. You can't. That's the nature of it. Like you don't know. Everything is A/B testing. Who knows? Like 3 people on the planet, right? And so if you're going to do that, you actually have to have like a remarkable appetite for risk and ambiguity and have buffer, right? So you need to place a lot of bets, but meaningful ones.
I feel like a lot of times, it also looks like communities of people that are sharing their findings. And so like there's a combination of small teams that are taking risks, but then also I think that like
Yeah.
having the underpinning of communities of small teams helps to make sure that they are sharing the things that they learned together. And when we look back across history, like that's where a lot of innovation happened, from Florence to Los Alamos to the Valley to all sorts of places where
Yes.
there were research labs. What do you think is next for AI Circle? Like, what do you hope the upcoming year looks like?
Yeah, it's a good question. One AI Circle, I actually got inspired by one of our early members, Adam Saw. He was, we had, okay, I just need to talk about this for a moment. I remember my first event, I was like sweating writing this Luma invite. I had to be perfect. And oh my gosh, what if people don't show up? It's happy hour in New York City, like who's,
Sure.
Yeah, who's gonna say no? But like, Adam is just such a great guy. One remarkably impressive guy, right? Early at Google, 3 IPOs, 25 patents, 100,000 lines of code. I love introducing that guy. He's just fucking remarkable. But one of the things I remember him saying was like, well, one, he's starting a fund called Zero Capital, and I remember him talking about how one, like his track record, right? Written dozens and dozens of checks, how many of them gone on to these huge companies, how so many people asked him to start a fund for many years. And he was walking me through the process. And as a, I'm not a finance guy, I'm not a VC guy, but just something I admire from the side is he said, Albert, when I start this, I'm committing to doing this for 10 years, right? In other words, he's not messing around, right? When it comes to people's money. And I think similarly, when it comes to people's relationships, like I see AI Circle as being a 10-year long endeavor, right? Like, how do you sustain and build a community for people that, like, if I'm saying, hey, let's play long term games with long term people in a short lived community, that doesn't make sense, right? And so, like, whatever I do, it will always be there. What the future holds for AI Circle this year, honestly, it's to figure out how to do as much good as possible and to do right by people. Like as a guy who has always worked to the numbers and things, like everything feels very vain when it comes to building a community, right? If we do good and people join or sign up, great. If we whatever don't do this and some people leave, man, that sucks. But guess what? Like there are more difficult partings in life than someone leaving a community, as an example, right? Like if we're really talking about like a community as this endeavor. So yeah, candidly, it's how do you adhere to the mission and vision, which is to be others oriented and to serve them, right? It's like, okay, like let's just do that as best and as hard as we can. And in the first year, everything's creative fiction anyway, right? I mean, so we might as well optimize for this, like solving for this core thing. And once we can actually do this and do this well and do this in a way that is steady, then we can figure out all the other things, right? But like right now, candidly, we've been around for 7, maybe 8 months now. There's a lot of just figuring out how to provide that value to our communities and our actual like city community.
Well, it's probably a good note to end on, Albert. So, I mean, let me do this. If people want to get in touch with you, if they want to find out more about AI Circle, where can they find you? Where can they find more about AI Circle?
Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn, and I'm an emerging Twitter or X, and at Albert Chun. And for AI Circle, go to www.ai-circle.org.
Fantastic. Albert, thank you
Awesome.
so much for taking the time. This was a really fun conversation, and I think you're building a really amazing community. So I
Thank you.
hope more people learn about it
For
and
sure.
are able to connect with you.
For sure. Thanks for being part of it, Adam.
Thank you for listening to the Open Story podcast. Each week, we share interviews with technology leaders, founders, and visionaries to discuss their stories and what they're most excited about. If you're interested in being interviewed, please reach out to us on our website, openstorypodcast.com. For the latest episodes, you can subscribe in your favorite podcast app or visit the website, once again, at openstorypodcast.com.